All right, it's 7 o'clock. I don't know, Daniel or Mark, okay, somebody will take care of admitting people, so I'm not having to do that.
I will.
We welcome everybody. I looked through the list of participants, and it's our standard group for the most part of people that participate, and I'm so happy to see you with us again this evening. This should be an interesting evening. I met Dr. Cicoria. Would you prefer me to call you Dr. Cicoria, or does it matter? Okay.
Tony.
Well, so I met Tony at the last IANS conference. I was fortunate enough to introduce him. He gave a presentation at that conference along about Labor Day, and of course, I've studied near-death experiences for some time, and I've often heard about people who come back from those experiences with special gifts. It could be psychic awareness. It could be healing capabilities. Tony came back with a little different set of skills, and I'll let him tell you about that. It should be an interesting evening. Tony is a thinking person. He's going to present information that will, for those of you who like a little intellectual challenge, will appreciate this. So let me let everybody know that we're recording this. We will, after Tony has made his presentation, we'll have questions and answers. The preference would be to have you put questions in chat. If we find that there are a lot of questions, that makes it easier to manage. If we don't get a lot of questions, and with this group, that may not be the case, but if we don't get a lot of questions, we may give people an opportunity to just speak up. So let's get to it, and let me turn it over to Tony. Go ahead, Tony.
Great. Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate your introduction, Jim. Thank you, and appreciate the help that you've given me in the past in managing these talks, which never seem to go as you expect them to go. Tonight, I want to talk about what I had talked about at the IANS meeting, which was what I consider the greatest hoax of all time, and it's the true nature of man. And thank you, Jim, for inviting me to this group. And this is my first slide. And essentially what I want to show, let's go to the second slide. The first thing I want to talk about is that we've been lied to since the beginning of time. It's always been present, and it's been an attempt to control the population, and it's always been about control. For example, the Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and that was to decide what the Catholic Church doctrines were going to be and what books would be included in the Bible. This was not something that came from on high. This was something that came from administration, and it was all to control people. And the Emperor Justinian subsequently convened the Second Ecumenical Council in 553 AD, and that was to get rid of the idea of reincarnation. The church authorities were not invited. He faked the results, and then he used arms to enforce it. And there were aspects of the God Yahweh and of Jesus Christ that were manipulated and falsified to ensure that man was perpetually going to live in fear. The judgment and the belief in God were containing man in a cycle of fear of heaven, hell, good, bad, God, and saviors. The single lifetime theory was found only in populations that descended from the Roman Empire or were influenced by them. The truth is that man has a dual nature, a spiritual and immortal nature, and a physical, mortal one. Pythagoras was one of the first people that believed that God created souls as spirit entities whose goal was to merge with the divine, to be eternal, to transmigrate, and to reincarnate. The reality is not what it seems. Our history has been hidden from us and shows that we've been involved in this struggle for far longer than we realize. Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest, gave us the history of Egypt from 10,000 years before the deluge, during divine rule, demigods, and eventually the pharaohs in 3100 BC. Berossus, who was a priest of the Babylonian god Marduk, wrote the history of the gods and man for 432,000 years before the deluge. And he prepared the Sumerian king's list that was written on stone and is on display in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. So this is not a new struggle that we find ourselves in. Let's go to slide number 3. So how did I get to this point in my life? Well, it wasn't by any doing of my own. In 1994, I was minding my own business, and I was trying to give my mother a call on a payphone, and I wasn't paying attention to what was going on around me, and the building got struck by lightning, and a bolt of lightning came out of the phone and hit me in the face and just threw me back like a rag doll. And as I was being thrown backwards, I had this very strange sensation of moving forward. And I was utterly confused. I remember standing there going, this is crazy. I know I got hit. I saw it. I know exactly what's going on. And I knew that I'd been thrown backwards. And now I don't understand why I'm standing here. And I'm completely mystified. And I'm looking around and I see the phone dangling. And right about then, I hear my mother-in-law screaming, and she's running down the stairs right at me. And the party, we were at a big party for about 25 people. It was all people in my wife's families that were having birthdays on that particular month in August of 1994. And so there are all these people there. They're all up on the first floor. I was outside running the barbecue, so I'm out there standing at the bottom of the stairs. And so she's running down the stairs at me, and as she's coming at me, I'm, thinking, oh, this can't be good. My mother-in-law's screaming and running at me, so I've done something bad. And then as she's coming closer to me, I'm realizing she doesn't even see me. She's looking over to her left. And I'm thinking, what the hell is going on? And she got right down in front of me and was like I didn't even exist. And she ran past me. And as she went past me, I turned to see where she was going. And I took a few steps, and suddenly I'm confronted with a terrible situation. I'm watching myself on the ground, and I'm not moving. And I walk over to this body that's on the ground, and all these people that are gathering around. And there was somebody who was waiting to use the phone, and she starts getting down to start CPR. And it turns out that she was a nurse. How fortuitous is that? And so she starts CPR, and I'm trying to tell everybody that I'm right here. And of course, nobody can hear me or see me, but I can hear and see them. Excuse me. So as I'm standing there, I'm absolutely struck by the fact that, oh my God, I'm thinking just like I normally would. I'm carrying on this conversation in my head in the same vernacular that I would normally speak. And the sudden realization came to me that whoever I am, I always am. And that this spirit form that I'm in has nothing to do with that carcass on the ground. And I'm still alive in a spiritual way, and I'm still thinking. And I realized that my spirit really just survives death. And that was a big shock. And I realized that there's nothing but a thin veil between the two, because I could see and hear them. They couldn't see or hear me, but I was very aware of everything that was going on from the very time it happened. And at that point, I realized, well, there's no point in standing here because this is kind of stupid. Nobody can hear me or see me. So I'm going to go, I'm going to leave. So I thought I would go and check on my family. And I walked away and I started to walk up some stairs because the party's up on the first floor. And as I started to go up the stairs, about the third step, I'm looking down at the ground because just out of habit, I'm watching the stairs to make sure I don't trip and fall, which is kind of silly. But as I'm looking down, I'm noticing that my legs are dissolving. And I thought, whoa, this is really getting to be kind of crazy. And as I kept walking up the stairs, by the time I got to the top of the stairs, I had lost all form. I was just a ball of energy. And at this point, I decided, well, there's no point in following the stairs. I just went through the wall and I came out on the other side of the wall, right above where my wife was sitting. And she was sitting on a couch and she was painting children's faces. And I made a careful note of where all the kids were standing and in what order they were all in. And I kept on my way and I was going diagonally through the room. And when I got out of the building was when things really started to get interesting, because it felt like I had fallen into a river of pure positive energy. If you could imagine absolute love and absolute peace with nothing else in it, that was what it was. And it had this bluish white, sparkly kind of light, and it reminded me of, as a kid, I remembered swimming in crystal clear water, and I would look up at the sun and I'd see this light shimmering through the water. And it reminded me of that. But the feeling of it was absolutely incredible, because it was, if you can imagine, nothing but love and peace in that feeling and in that energy. And I was trying to understand the energy, and I'm looking around thinking, what is this? This is so powerful. I'm sure I could measure it. And it's the old science brain kicking in. But as I looked around, I noticed that this energy ran through everything. And it was almost in the shape of a sine wave. And it ran through the energy ran through everything. And you could see that the energy was what made up all of these things. And I felt sure that this must be the God energy, but I had no idea where it was or where it was coming from. At least, and at that point, I was ecstatic. I was thinking, this is the greatest thing that could ever happen to somebody. And I had the sensation of moving. I could see that I was moving. I felt like I was in a river that was just carrying me away. And I had this sensation of seeing the high points and low points in my life. It was kind of like a collage of pictures on a wall. And it didn't really have a whole lot of meaning for me, other than the fact that it just presented the information and I was moving on. And right about the time I realized that this was the greatest thing that could ever happen to me. And I was excited to go wherever it was taking me. And suddenly somebody flipped a switch and I was back in my body. And I was pissed. I was so angry that I was calling out in my head to anybody who would listen, gods, angels, whoever. And I said, please don't make me go back. And I came to realize that it's not my choice. And I was back in this body, and God, it hurt. The place where the lightning hit me in the face and where it came out my foot felt like two pokers had been stuck in and just let them burn right there. And at that point, I was back in the body, and I wasn't conscious yet because I could tell that the person who had been doing CPR had stopped. She was just kneeling next to me. And I was trying to wake up, and it seemed like it took a number of minutes before I could do that. And finally, I was able to wake up enough to say something. And then, of course, I said something stupid. When I was able to say anything, I looked at the nurse and I wanted to thank her for saving my life. And the only thing that came out was, gee, thanks for, it's okay, I'm a doctor. And she just laughed and said, well, you weren't a minute ago. And I thought, okay, it's time to shut up and leave. And at that point, the police came and they wanted to take me to the hospital, and I just refused because, you know, I knew I was alive, and with lightning, you're either alive or dead. There's not much in between. And so I didn't feel like going and sitting for hours in an emergency room. And I called my family doctor and my neurologist, told them what happened, and I had my family drive me home, and I saw them when I got there. And so the realization that I had with all of this was that consciousness survives death, and that the energy of love and peace was something that was incredible. And one of the other things that happened shortly after that was that I had this incredible desire to hear classical piano music. And this was about 2 weeks after the lightning event, and which was a departure for me because I was a kid of the 60s and there was no place in my life for classical music. My mother had made me take piano lessons when I was 7 years old for a year, which I dutifully did, and then quickly and promptly forgot how to do anything with it, as it just was not something that I was interested in. And so this was a departure, and I was overcome with the desire to hear this music, so much so that I actually drove an hour to Albany, New York, from where I lived, to find a place that had some classical piano music. And I bought a CD called, it was Vladimir Ashkenazy playing his favorite Chopin. And I was so taken with the music, I was beside myself. And I listened to it constantly. I made everyone else listen to it. And I'm sure they were pretty sick of it by the time the CD had finally worn out. But that didn't deter me. And at some point in that short period of time, I realized that it wasn't going to be enough to hear music, because I really wanted to learn how to play it. But that was going to be a problem since I didn't have a piano and I didn't know how to play. So the next day, it seems that one of our babysitters came by and said, gee, you know, I have to move, and I have this old upright piano that I need to store for a year. Could I leave it at your house? And I thought, wow, talk about coincidence. And at this point, I said, sure. And we suddenly had a piano in the house. And a couple of weeks after that, I have this dream. And the dream is like an out-of-body experience where I was in this dream, and I'm walking out onto a stage in a performance theater. And I see that my normal form is out on a stage, and I'm playing at a concert hall. And I'm walking up behind myself at this performance theater, and I'm listening to the music, and I get this sudden realization that, geez, this is not somebody else's music, this is mine. And at that point, I was absolutely baffled. But I listened to the music carefully and thought, I need to remember this music. And the ending of this piece had a loud crashing ending. It woke me up, and it was 3:15 in the morning. And I got up and I walked out to that piano, and I had no idea how to play or to write. And so I tried to plunk out some of the melodies that I heard, but I just said, the hell with this, and I went to bed. But at that point, and from that point on, whenever I sat down at the piano to try to teach myself how to play, that music from the dream would start playing. And if I didn't pay attention to it, it would become very insistent, and it would start to play in my head and interfere with whatever else I was doing. And so that was really an important element of this whole thing. I had died, and I had come back with something that I didn't have before. And one of the things that was interesting from all of that was I had come into contact with Dr. Daryl Treefort, who was a specialist in savants. And he had asked me to be part of a study group of his. And he was studying people like me who had had some sort of event, either brain trauma or surgery, any number of things, but they all had one thing in common, and that was they had a new ability that they had no idea they had. And so that really made me think that, we all have enormous abilities. We don't have any clue as to how we developed them or where they came from, but we do have them. And I spent essentially the next 27 years trying to understand where this stuff comes from and what it means. Could I have the next slide, please? So what does science tell us about near-death experiences? Well, first of all, it's not a new idea. The first recorded case was in Plato's The Republic. Who was a soldier in Pamphylia. He was the son of Arminius. He was killed in a battle. 10 days later, they were getting ready to burn him on a funeral pyre. And he woke up and he started relaying the stories of having gone to the underworld and told people what was awaiting for them in the afterlife, and that the just were rewarded, the wicked were punished, and souls were reborn to a new life. And out of all of that, and over decades and decades of years, there are two schools of thought have really developed. One is what's called a materialist or reductionist view, and that's nothing exists except objective reality. Consciousness comes from the brain, and most science falls into that category. Oliver Sacks, Kevin Nelson, many others. And they have always considered consciousness and near-death experiences just an event of a dying brain. It's a natural end of a process. And the other way of looking at it is non-reductionist, that consciousness is not located in the brain. It's non-local. And there are lots of scientists that fall into that category. Dr. Pim Van Lommel, Bruce Grayson, Sam Parnier, Ray Moody, the list goes on and on and on. Consciousness is not local. It's not located in a particular place in space or time. And it all comes down to one thing: what is consciousness? It's a difficult concept. And as Ian Stevenson said, there's nothing more troublesome than a new idea, particularly in science. And I think that one of the really instructive cases that we have in our armamentarium is a case from Pam Reynolds. Now, Pam Reynolds is a famous case, and this was a woman who had had a near-death experience, but is one of the few truly monitored near-death experiences that we have. So Pam was having severe headaches, and she went to see her doctor. Dr. Michael Sabom, and he did a CAT scan of her head, and she was found to have a large aneurysm at the base of her brain. And this was a type of aneurysm that was going to explode, and she would die instantly. And what was interesting about it is he sent her to see a specialist, Robert Spetzler, who was a neurosurgeon in Phoenix, Arizona. And Dr. Spetzler had pioneered a special type of surgery called stand still. And that surgery would be done by putting you on heart bypass and cooling your body down to 60 degrees, draining all the blood out of the brain, and they would safely open the skull and remove the aneurysm. So Pam decided she was going to do this, and she was taken to the operating room, and she was anesthetized. And they hooked up these auditory monitors that would deliver 100 decibel clicks to both ears through some headphones. And they recorded the brainstem response to those clicks 3 different ways. They continually recorded it. And then she was subjected to hypothermic cardiac arrest. So they cooled her body down to 60 degrees, and they put her on an ECMO machine, the extracorporeal membrane oxygenator. And they stopped her heart. Her body temperature was taken down to 60 degrees. And then they had to drain the blood out of the brain. So they bring the table up. So the head is up in the air and gravity takes over and drains the blood out. And the hypothermic cardiac arrest machine, the ECMO, is stopped. So here you have a situation where somebody has documented cardiac arrest. They have documented complete flatline EEG. There's not a thing going on upstairs. And when it was safe to do so, he opens up the skull and he removes the aneurysm, takes it out. And at that point, they level the table back again. They restart the bypass machine, they rewarm the body, and they restart her heart with two shocks. And her EEG and her cardiac rhythm were restored, which sounds like a great ending to a complicated story. But it was just a beginning, because in the ICU where she was taken to recover, despite the fact that she had a flatline EEG and cardiac monitoring, she had had an out-of-body experience where she heard the cardiac surgeon say to the neurosurgeon, "This right femoral artery is too small to use for bypass. I'm going to have to open the left." She heard that and she remembered it. And she saw Dr. Spetzler using instruments, one of them, which was called a Midas Rex. That's an awful instrument. It's loud and it makes some horrible noise when it cuts through bone. And she was able to describe in detail what it looked like and what it sounded like. And she saw all of this while she was sitting on his shoulder. And at some point, she had left the operating room and went up into a tunnel that had opened above in the ceiling. And she went up there and she saw this bright light at the end, and she started walking toward it. And her grandmother and her uncle met her in this tunnel and started to stop her and said, "You can't go toward the light. You have to go back." And she was angry because she didn't want to go back. And they managed to get her turned around, and they took her back to the entrance to the tunnel. And at one point they pushed her out, and that coincided with her heart restarting. And one of the things that she also talked about in the recovery room was how angry she was to hear the music that they were playing in the operating room. So when Dr. Spetzler finished the main part of the surgery, he turned it over to the residents who were then going to do the wound closures. And they put on some music from the Eagles, and the song was called the Hotel California. And the reason she was angry about it was because there was one line in that song which says, you can sign out anytime you like, but you can never leave. And she was mad because she wanted to leave and go to the light, and she was not able to, and she felt cheated. And so here she is, somebody who has complete brain dead and cardiac dead, yet has consciousness. And so this is one of the best examples we have of consciousness being documented, despite the fact that all the parameters that we have to measure said that it's not possible. Could I have the next slide, please?
Tony, I need to interrupt you. Your computer seems to be making various dings and beeps and boops.
Yeah, I don't know how to shut it off. If you have any ideas, tell me. It's
Can you close the program? It's probably a messenger program.
Yeah,
something like
I think
Skype
it is.
or so. If you close that, it should stop. Okay.
Yeah. How do I find that?
I can't really help there. Give us a moment, everybody, while Dr. Cicoria finds his.
If we can't get it relatively quickly, I'd say let's move on.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know how to do it. Certainly not without screwing up everything else.
Okay, doctor. Thank you.
So anyway, so how is non-local consciousness even possible? How can we be conscious of things that we have no idea how they're connected? And Dr. Pim van Lommel, who's a cardiologist, said that consciousness is not located in a particular time and place, and therefore it is non-local. It's also called entangled. And entanglement is a quantum physics term that I'm going to ask Dr. Quantum to give us a short lecture on for a couple of minutes, because it'll be well worth his perspective of what this actually means.
Okay, now an announcement for people who are listening on their phones, perhaps. If this is not visible on your screen, it will not be audible to you either. So don't think anything is wrong with your connection.
Great-great-granddaddy of wacky quantum weirdness is entanglement. If time reversal symmetry destroys the notion of time, then entanglement crushes our experience of space. Two objects, two electrons created together, are entangled. Send one to the other side of the universe. Now, do something to one, and the other responds instantly. Instantly. So, either information is traveling infinitely fast, or, in reality, they are still connected. They are entangled. And since everything was entangled at the moment of the Big Bang, that means everything is still touching. Space is just the construct that gives the illusion that there are separate objects. Are we far enough down the rabbit hole yet?
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So what is it that we know about consciousness? Unfortunately, not a lot. The universe is conscious and connected. It is aware of itself and instantaneously communicates. And what that video showed you is something that was proven by Bell's theorem. John Bell was a guy that had come up with a way to be able to prove that two molecules can immediately respond to one another, regardless of their separation. And how do we fit that into a model? And there's, everybody likes to come up with some way to explain things. And there was the Penrose-Hameroff model, which said that consciousness existed somewhere outside the brain. Our brains were just merely conscious converters that were receivers and transmitters at the same time. Robin Kelly, who is a physician, said that the brain was not the seat of consciousness. It was just a vessel through which consciousness was relayed. And Bell's theorem proved entanglement and proved the non-locality of consciousness. Next slide. So where does consciousness come from? And there's not a lot of great information out there, but there are some really notable experiments. In 1981, there was an experiment by Don Elkins, Jim McCarty, and Carla Rucker. And Don was at the University of Louisville, and he was a teacher there, besides being an airline pilot. And he was trying to come up with a way of contacting an alien civilization. And so he had worked out a deal with two of his friends, Jim McCarty and Carla Rucker. And Carla was going to be a channel, and they were going to try to use her to contact an alien civilization. So they went through this procedure. And what was interesting was that they didn't contact an alien race as they hoped, but they did contact what's called Ra. And Ra was a social memory complex of 6 density beings from the confederation of planets in the service of the great one infinite creator. And they spent the next 4 years having channeling sessions where they would ask questions of this social memory complex about life and about consciousness and where everything came from. And one of the books, and there's a total of 5 books that they published with this. And it's interesting that they were talking about, where does consciousness come from? Where did everything start? And if you think back at what it says in Genesis, there are some dovetail moments here where what they say and what was said in the Bible are very similar. They said, in the beginning, there was infinity. Somehow, infinity became aware of itself. And that awareness led to a focus of infinity, the creator, and into infinite energy or love. Love being the infinite creator. That energy moved from intelligent infinity due to an outpouring of creative force, which created patterns in the holographic style as an entire creation. The patterns of energy regularized their own local rhythms and fields of energy and created dimensions in universes and physical matter. Light, as a vibrational distortion of infinity, became the building block of matter. Light was intelligent and full of energy, and thus the first thing of intelligent infinity, called a creative principle. The spiraling energy produced galaxies, suns, planets, and consciousness of planetary entities. All things, all life, all creations are all part of one original thought. It all came from one source and somehow exist in the quantum field that we know very little about. 96% of the quantum field is dark energy. 72% of it is dark energy and 24% is dark matter, which we know essentially nothing about. And the 4% is what we can see, which is pretty scary. So love is some type of high order energy that causes intelligent energy to be formed from the potential of infinity. It's the great activator and the primary co-creator of various creations using intelligent infinity. Love creates light. Love is the vibration that produces light, which can condense into material because of the rotations of the vibration of the quantized units or intervals of angular velocity, none of which I really understand. But the point that I think is important there is when I was on the other side and I saw the energy, I could see the energy and the vibration of that energy creating everything and was part of everything. So, next slide, please. So what is reality? What did I really see? Did I see the God energy? We see in our brains are really designed to see certain molecular configurations. So we see objects that are made of molecules that are held together in some form that our brain recognizes. But the actual particles that make up these atoms and the atoms that make up objects, all of those particles are shared with other things. So they're not germane to one particular thing. The quantum electrodynamics says that the physical reality is entirely an illusion. And as Einstein says, it's a persistent one. Everything exists as an energy in a waveform that requires an observation by consciousness to collapse that waveform and to precipitate an image. Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty suggested that light can be a wave or a particle, depending on what the experimenter is looking for. Physical reality is somehow an equilibrium with the 0-point field and constantly is changing. The fundamental properties do not exist until they're observed. We all exist in a quantum field and somehow are connected to one another. I think one of the great examples of that is in the animals. So if you live at the end of a dark, desolate street and you have a dog and it's late at night, one night you're all by yourself and there's no lights on the street and it's just you and the dog, and somebody suddenly knocks on the door. The dog goes absolutely crazy and is angry and is sounding all kinds of warnings. and is telling you something's wrong with this situation, don't answer the door. And what the dog knows is that the person on the other side of the door has evil intent. Somehow we've lost that ability to really understand that. And that's really a sad statement on our lives. But I think it's because we don't pay attention. I think that we can recapture that ability, but it's not something that's readily available. Next slide, please. So light is an entirely unique construct and is probably the centerpiece of everything that we know and don't understand. And there were some incredible experiments that were done on what the nature of light is. And this is called the double slit experiment, which I think is worth listening to. And Dr. Quantum does a nice job of explaining the true nature of light. Could we go ahead and play this? That was a quote by Bruce Lipton.
As mentioned earlier, everything is made up of infinite potentiality, and the moment consciousness decides to create from that, creation takes place. The findings of physicist Thomas Young in his famous double slit experiment helps to show this, and while doing so, sheds light on the quantum field and how our entire reality operates.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern! We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter, through. We get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave. It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched.
So what does this tell us about our reality? It tells us that the moment there is consciousness viewing and defining how things should act, the infinite potentials act in that manner. The electron acted in the way consciousness defined it should act. We see two slits, we have particles. We define that they must pass through the two slits and create two lines on the other side. However, before it is defined, the particle carries out every possibility. It is limitless. Consciousness, the observer, who we truly are, is in control of our entire reality. How we define our world and what plays out is entirely up to the collective scale. The world is infinite potential and infinite possibility. Our consciousness can shape it in any way we choose.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the next big question then becomes, so what happens when we do die? What place did I go to when I died? And I've struggled with this for 27 years. And recently there's been an interesting series of books called the Man Being series. And these authors have channeled from a world of what's called Lyra, that's an intermediate world that when you leave your body and you go someplace else, this intermediate place that we go is what they call Lyra. And you're faced with two choices. You can decide that you've had enough and you want to progress to the next highest level of spirituality. And there's multiple densities of beings, as I've alluded to earlier. And that's one pathway. And the other pathway is to reincarnate and come back here and do this all again. And what they have indicated is that there are forces that have hijacked the process from our earliest history that try to force us to reincarnate and come back to this existence as slaves. And this force is, they're calling it the Orion DRA Alliance. And they use judgment and the fear of God to control us for their financial and energetic gains. So where is the truth? I'm not entirely sure, but I certainly find this a very interesting concept. We've never been told any truth about our true existence, our spirituality, or origin, or our gods. Everything we have experienced from church and state has been to control our development and spiritual evolution, and I think it's time we start to take it back. Next slide. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony. That was, I've seen some of these before. Obviously, I saw your presentation before, but I had seen that Dr. Quantum before, and I found watching his presentations makes it a little easier to digest something that's a bit challenging. Quantum physics, the quantum physicists themselves struggle with this. They understand that there are implications for our spirituality, but as scientists, it makes them very uncomfortable hypothesizing about that.
I think that's a good thing and a bad thing. It keeps everybody honest, and unfortunately, the truth is never going to be readily available. But I think that we're getting little glimpses here and there of how it actually works, and through the courage of different authors to bring this stuff forward, and the ingenuity of trying to find ways to get that information is not only challenging, but is great for us. And what I have been finding is that it's not just one source. Now I'm seeing, the same information coming from multiple sources, and you look at, the information from the Ra series, and from the Man Being series, and from the ancient Sumerians. And I mean, they went through a lot of trouble to write this stuff in stone, so we would be able to have that information. And unfortunately, it's been buried, it's been divided up and taken to different museums, and the great majority of it has never been translated, which is a sad statement. We may have the answer to all of our questions right here in front of us.
Yeah, the difficulty, I'm thinking back to my own experience when 20 years ago, I was studying the origins of Christianity and came to the conclusion that a lot of things I believed in just weren't based on fact. It was very difficult for me to accept that what I believed in was not built on a solid foundation. And I think it takes, I don't think everybody's capable of suspending long-held beliefs. So it's very difficult for some people to, it's very difficult for some people to, even when presented with information, to willingly accept it, because it means they're going to have to let go of something they've believed in for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, I was brought up Catholic, and, one of the first big things that upset my apple cart was back, oh God, this is 50 years ago, anyway, 60 years ago, where if you ate meat on Friday, you went straight to hell. You did not collect $200. You did not pass go. You went straight to hell. And that was what I was taught. And then I remembered all of a sudden the Catholic Church reversed that. and said, well, we've reconsidered this and we're going to let everybody eat meat on Fridays. And I remember going to school the next day, and I was in a Catholic school at the time. And I said to one of the nuns, I said, wait a minute. I said, what about all those people that went to hell? What about them? And she said, never mind. You're too young to understand this. I'm like, okay, well, you just lost another customer, my friend, because that, for me, that was the end of a whole lifetime of believing one particular thing, because, you know, that didn't fit. And for them to be arbitrary about it and just decide, well, we're going to change the rules. Okay.
Must have been difficult for you though. You were a child, I assume, at that time, or
Yeah.
and you're going to a Catholic school, so you're surrounded by people who subscribe to the Catholic notion of things. For you to say you just lost me meant you had to turn your back on, everything you knew.
Yeah. I mean, that was a challenge. And that was just one of many. You know, the biggest challenge was my own near-death experience, because that flew in the face of everything I'd been taught. And so, you know, I found, interestingly, I became much more spiritual, but far less religious. You know,
Here's a
because I
question
felt
for
like,
you. A lot of near-death experiencers are challenged by what they experienced. Most of them probably have not been exposed to the concept of a near-death experience. So they come through this and their world is turned upside down. I know some people, it takes them years to try to figure it all out. Can you maybe comment, when you had your near-death experience, you just said that it was very challenging for you. Did it take you a while to fully embrace what had happened to you and the implications?
you know, it took me a long time to really come to deal with it, for a lot of reasons. One, it wasn't something, you know, in 1994, it was not something you could readily talk to people about. And in my profession of medicine, if I went around saying, you know, I had this near-death experience and I saw the other side and all these other things happened, people would have me locked up. And it was just not acceptable for a physician to have those sorts of views. And because they would actually, physicians would turn on each other in that respect. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. I'll tell a few people. I'll read as much as I can to try to understand, which is what I did do. And then the music kind of took over a lot of aspects of my life. And I really felt like it was the only reason I was here. And
So you didn't talk much about the music in your presentation. Can you add a little to that? You heard this music and you realized it was yours. Did you ever set about trying to recreate it and record it?
I did. And it took a long time, because when this journey started, I didn't know how to play and I didn't have a piano. Magically, a piano appears, and I started trying to teach myself. And I realized very quickly that that was just not something I was going to be able to do. And so I started taking lessons, and I would, I told my teacher about all this stuff, and I would take part of the music that I heard, and it was always playing the same way in my head. So I had an internal control, which was nice. And I kept trying to learn how to play and to write. And I would have my teacher, I would play some part of it for the teacher and say, how would I write this? And, she would say, well, it's this particular type of form and you'd have to do it this way. But she never would help me do it. But it, gave me some idea of how complicated this was going to be. And one of the things that happened was I started to join a piano club. It was in Bennington, Vermont. They had this thing called Piano Sonata, which is it met multiple times a year, and it was for adults that love piano. And so I started going once a year, and I would go in May. And in 2006, when I went, I met a lady named Erica Vanderlyn Feidner. Erica was the #1 salesperson at Steinway, New York City. She had left Steinway and went to Bosendorfer, and her sister owned the place where this camp was, this piano camp. And so in 2006, she shows up and she's got all these brand new pianos for people to play. She had them brought in. And we got talking about this, my love of the piano and this music that was haunting me. And she, she said, there's only one person that can tell this story, and that's Oliver Sacks. At the time, I didn't know who Oliver was, other than the fact that he wrote the book Awakenings. And so that was in May, and about a month later, I get a phone call from Oliver Sacks. She knew him, and she called him and said, you got to talk to this crazy guy that's in upstate New York, because, he had this story and has all this music thing happening, and it would be an interesting thing for you to evaluate. And so Oliver called me and said, could you come down here? I'd like you to be one of my patients. And so I went down in August of that year, 2006, and got to spend a whole day with an absolute genius, which was an incredible experience for me. And at the end of the night, when we were standing there saying goodbye at the door, he looked at me and he said, that music from the dream went through an awful lot of trouble to get here. The least you can do is write it. And I was so taken by what he said to me that when I got home, the first thing I did was I went out and bought a program called Sibelius, which is writing music for dummies. And I sat down and I spent the next 7 months every single night until I couldn't see straight, trying to put that music down on paper. And I did that. And the thing that was great for me was that the music always played the same exact way in my head. And so I had the internal control, and I would try to write something on the computer with an electric piano, and it was either exactly what the music was or it wasn't. And so I just kind of muddled through, comparing the, I would write it until whatever I wrote sounded like what I heard in my head. And I went through this process, and, there were times I had to ask for help from my teacher. And, she'd say, that's a 5-on-4 and you got to do it this way. And, and it's like, okay, but I managed to get through it. And then in the following May of 2007, I played the piece for my piano group, which was about 25 people. And then while I was there at the meeting, I got a call from Oliver, and he said, I would like to use your story in my book that's coming out soon. And I thought, okay, what's the big deal with that? And I thought, sure, why not? He said, good, because the first chapter is going to be in the New Yorker July 23rd. I said, really? And he said, yeah, it'll be great. And I thought, okay, this is going to change some things. And sure enough, it came out and all hell broke loose. Because at that point there was a lot of interest in it and a lot of interest in the music. And I had, where I lived in Oneonta, New York, a friend of mine, Carlton Clay, who was the head of the music department at the State University of New York in Oneonta. And he called me up and said, hey, I'd like you to play this piece for one of my classes, and so we can talk about it. And I thought, all right, that would be interesting. And I did that, and where I committed to doing that. And about a week later, he called and he says, geez, there's getting an awful lot of interest in this, and I think that I'd rather have you do something a little bigger, maybe, play it for the group of classes at one time, and we can talk about it then. And I thought, all right, that's still fine. And then 2 weeks later, he calls up and he says, look, he said, I know this is getting to be way bigger than I thought. And he said, would you consider doing a performance at the Goodrich Theater, which is a performing arts theater? And I said, Jesus, Carlton, I don't have the faintest idea how to do something like that. I said, I don't have it polished. I don't have it memorized. I don't have the faintest idea how to do any of that stuff. And he says, it'll be fine. I should have run when I heard that. And so at that point, now it's the fall of 2007, and I've committed myself to doing this performance January 29th in 2008. And it was my birthday, so it was kind of a rebirth. And so I managed to, I called my teacher and I told her what a mess I'd gotten myself into. And I said, how can I do this? And she said, we're going to have to work 3 or 4 hours a day to get you ready for this. And I'm like, oh my God. And that's what we did. And I mean, from the very beginning of, she would make me walk out onto the stage, and how was I supposed to do it correctly? And, she would sit up in the top of the amphitheater, and she'd say, I can't hear you. I'm like, oh, geez. It was an interesting challenge. But, by the time the concert actually got there were 3 television crews, one from the BBC One from Granada Media, and one from German television. And it was an absolute zoo. All of these people had come in to record this event, and but I got to meet some incredible people, and Alan Yentob, who was the head of the BBC One, came and spent the whole day with me. So it was pretty humbling experience, to say the least. And then I managed to get through the music without screwing it up.
We have a question that Shirley has posed to you. This goes back to the conversation we're having about your Catholic conversion experience. So Shirley says, how have you taken back your life now that you know all about the control others had over your life?
Could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, well, how has Tony taken back his life now that he knows all about the control others had over his life? So you had to reject all these. You saw all the control issues around you, and when I'm kind of reading into this a bit. When you realized that there was all this control stuff going on, somehow you turned your back on that. How did you reformulate your life now that you had to let go of all this stuff?
Well, and my comment about being more spiritual as opposed to being religious has to do with that, because I've come to realize, that the truth of what our reality is that our consciousness survives death. We're not here for anyone else. We're here for our own spiritual development and to climb the ladder, so to speak, of spiritual growth. And this is a proving ground, if you will. We go through this, and do we live in service to self or service to others? And that, from what I've read, seems to be an important detail in your evolution. If you live your life for your own personal gain and you don't think about other people, you're destined to do this again. But on the other hand, if you live your life not self-centered, but in most of the things that you do, if you consider the way other people, if you consider their needs first, you get points, which somehow get translated into what happens to you afterwards.
We have another individual who's wants to pose a question. Sheila, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, I really enjoyed the talk. I thought it was very interesting. And about 3 things came up for me, all related to perhaps what is happening during an NDE in the brain. You mentioned entanglement, the concept. It was mentioned in one of the videos. And I think it's interesting to note that Donald Hoffman, who is now mathematically defining consciousness, and his definitions of consciousness supplant the precepts that the scientists Einstein, Newton, and Max Planck have laid down for us. But the 2 things that he's having trouble mathematically defining are entanglement and free will. He thinks that free will is a conscious agent, and it comes into the headset or the major control center, and then the choice is made, and then it disappears. And with entanglement, there's some similar issues with the mathematics. My question for you is, do you think that during an NDE, there could be some entanglement that is influencing what happens? In other words, is there a part of us that's somewhere else? And during an NDE, it comes into the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere is very quiet, so we absorb it and become or experience part of our real self that has been somewhere else. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, the short answer to that is yes, because there are many things that I have read and that suggest that past, present, future all exist at one time, and that there are multiple dimensions, multiple of ourselves that are all experiencing an infinite number of realities. And it's possible that they can interfere with one another or they can cross. And, the fact that entanglement exists just makes it even more difficult to understand, because everything is aware of everything else. I mean, we are aware on some level of every part of ourselves that could be someplace else in another reality or another world.
Good. Yeah, I agree. There's just one other point I want to make. I'm learning a lot about EEGs now, and I've come to realize that there are different parameters that define death, especially brain death. And in some areas, in some jurisdictions, the EEG is used as a legal indication of death, brain death. However, it's controversial because it's not in every jurisdiction, cannot be used legally in every jurisdiction. So there's controversy about it. And I realized that, if there's that one synapse left firing in the brain, the EEG is not going to detect it. So you have to be very careful about interpretation there. So you mentioned that early in the talk, and I thought I would mention that, EEG measures the majority of signals in the brain that are happening. It amplifies it times 1,000, and then it doesn't localize anything. So it has a good purpose. It's just in defining brain death, we may need to take a step back and say, not so definite.
That's a really important concept. And I have some real reservations about using any kind of instrument like that to declare somebody's brain dead. Because if you look at the literature, there's lots of cases where they go to harvest somebody's organs and suddenly the heart rate starts going up and the body starts to respond like, hey, we're not dead yet. So I have some real reservations about that. And I think until we have some clear way of proving that somebody has left the body and they're not coming back, do you think you have to really be careful?
Yeah.
And I for one have not put on my license that I want to be harvested just for that reason. And because I don't know that people have the real ability to make that call. And
Right.
I don't think we don't have any machines that I think can reproducibly and unequivocally make it.
Well, you go look back at the Pam Reynolds case. I mean, at some point in her operation, there was no blood flowing through her body. Her brain had flatlined. Heart's not beating. There's this, in terms of our current medical knowledge, she's dead.
Yeah, absolutely dead.
And yet, they resuscitate her after doing the repair on the aneurysm. So the question becomes, how long can you be dead? I remember, what was her name? The woman, the orthopedic surgeon, Mary Neal.
Mary Neal, yeah.
I tell my 92-year-old mother about some of these things, and she just can't. It's hard for her to wrap her mind around it. I told her about Mary Neal's story and how she was underwater for 20 or 30 minutes and had a near-death experience. And my mother's reaction was, that's impossible. You can't be underwater for 20 or 30 minutes and survive. Well, Mom, this is her story, So a couple of years later, the Netflix series Surviving Death comes out. And the first episode is about people who've had near-death experiences. We have Jose with us tonight, but Mary was one of the featured people. My mother watched that, and now for some reason it's a little more acceptable to her. It's not her son that's telling her this. She's seen it on television. But
yeah, I mean, it is. I think another interesting case was Daniel Brinkley. Daniel had, it was actually the first book I ever read about near-death experiences was his book. And he had a similar experience with lightning that I had. And I thought it was incredible that, not only was he dead, but they had stopped CPR and they'd given up and they were putting him in their freezer. And the morgue attendant saw the sheet move because the only thing that he could do at that point was exhale loudly. Nothing else worked. And the morgue attendant saw the sheet move and said, "Oh my God, he's not dead," and ran back with him to the emergency room, and they started again. And, that just, there's so much unknown. It's just incredible.
Mhm. It's interesting in near-death experiences. Quite often people are told it's not your time, you've got to go back, which implies that there is a time that you're supposed to actually make your transition. Sheila talked a minute ago. She's pretty knowledgeable about Akashic records. So I find it interesting. Where's the balance between free will and something that's already predetermined? If there is a specific time that we are supposed to make our transition to the non-physical, that tends to say some aspect of our lives is predetermined.
Yeah, I mean, and interestingly, in some of the stuff that I've read about, a lot of people talk about the fact that when you leave here and you go to wherever this other place is, you meet with advisors, you meet with people to help you plan out what your next step is going to be. And if you decide to come back here, you have things that you've decided, you've predetermined that you're going to work on. And the one thing that free will gives, it gives you the absolute right to screw everything up at any moment. And you think to yourself, okay, so what's the real value of free will? And I think that the real value is in the growth, because it gives you the opportunity to experience the good and the bad. And how do you decide whether something is really a good unless you've experienced what the bad is as well? So, and I recently read another book that was, that goes along that same line, and it was called something about the helping hand, and how the concept of free will was introduced into mankind to allow him to grow spiritually.
Mm-hmm. So here's an interesting, you made a point a minute ago about how there's some evidence that we plan what our experiences are going to be. When we're in the non-physical realm, we work with others to, I think that's what you were saying, to kind of plan the major things that we'd like to have happen in this life. If that's true, then there would seem to be things that will happen in our lives that are intended to push us in a direction. And maybe this group of people that are assembled here tonight might appreciate this more than the average person, but maybe we ought to try to be more aware and attuned to those nudges that happen in our lives.
The God winks.
Yeah.
As they call.
I know I've talked with Jose is with us tonight. There's an interesting parallel between you and Jose. You both had experiences on the other side. In your case, it was your music. In Jose's case, it was colored light that helped heal him. And you both came back focused. There's something about this that I need to work with. In your case, it was embedded in your mind, and it's like you were a tape recorder. It was recorded, and you could always go back and replay a piece of it. Jose took these colors and tried to recreate them in a computer, a digital computer format. So these things that happen sometimes in this near-death state, I suspect that there's something behind the scenes that is providing this to you. And then when you come back into this physical reality, you have something that has become an objective in life. And all these near-death objectives that come back are adding to a growing awareness of who we are, that there's so much more than the materialist view of things.
Yeah.
Now, aren't you an anesthesiologist, or what was your?
I'm an orthopedic surgeon.
Okay. I worked in anesthesia, not on the medical side, but on the management side. So I was always around doctors and nurses, and it was interesting. It seemed the nurses were more open to these types of spiritual things than the doctors were.
Yeah, historically, physicians have been terrible about this whole concept. And one of the great things that IONS has been doing is it's been part of different organizations trying to educate new doctors. And so, I've taken part in some of these things, and I've given lectures to young people who are coming up, and to make them aware that these things are going to happen to them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people are going to come up and say, I had this happen, and the worst thing in the world you can do is to tell them it's in their imagination.
Yep.
But that was pretty much the rule of thumb back, even 20 years ago.
We have another near-death experiencer with us tonight, Paula Lenz. Paula spoke here before. And my sense is that these near-death experiences, I've said this, I'm not sure whether I've said it to this group or not, but they're like a gift, that people come back and share this experience, and it helps nudge us along the path of recognizing we can't be solely focused on the human side of us, that there's a bigger reality, a bigger piece of us, that if we could learn to appreciate that, it would help us become more loving expressions of love.
Yeah. Jose had a question.
Hey, Tony, how are you?
Good, sir. How are you?
Question. I'm good. And I just want to speak a little. The question really revolves the skill. So what are your thoughts regarding how we came about coming back with this knowledge or this skill? I think about it all the time, because I understand consciousness survives, but consciousness survives. And how do we look at that? Does it mean I go in and I come out complete? But in our case, it seems like we went in and we came back with something else. And I always find it curious, but I'm wondering, what do you attribute that to? Is it something that might have something to do with disentanglement theory? Is there like a doppelganger somewhere that we kind of, because when I had my near-death experience, I always thought I dissolved and became entangled with other beings and came back. And that was part of my struggle. How do I regain my identity back and my compulsion to paint without ever painted, never painting in my life? Where do you even start? And I think you had that same challenge, but what do you attribute that to, that having that consciousness that wasn't there before?
One of the things, Oliver Sacks and I used to go round and around about this stuff, which was a great discussion for me. And one of the things that he had said to me was that he thought the lightning had scrambled some circuits in my brain that made them made me have access to new areas of my brain that I didn't know I had. And I thought about that a lot. And I think that it goes a step farther. You know, the question becomes, where is memory located? And there's lots of people that have come forward and said, you know, there's no way in the world that your brain can have all of this stuff embedded in memory. It's not a big enough space to carry all of that information. So then it becomes a question of, well, okay, where is that information stored? And why can I have access to that information now and I couldn't do it before? And I think that it has something to do with the actual event of crossing over and the lightning from however it happened, or it doesn't have to just be lightning. It could be from whatever caused the event, that the event itself somehow thins the veil and allows you to have access to parts of your memory in the Akashic records that you didn't have before. And I really believe that it has more to do with that than anything. It's that you now you've got a small connector that goes to this other place where all this stuff is stored, and you have access to everything that you have ever done in your eons of existence in a spiritual form. It's all there, it's all written down, and it's just a matter of knowing how to access it. And we don't know how we've accessed it, but we know the end result. The end result is your painting is there. You've done this before in some form or some different spiritualness. And we've all had those things. We just don't know how to get to them.
I have a comment that supports exactly what you just said. And I'd like to sort of reference a document that was released by the Department of Defense about 18 months ago. The research that they did in 1985 on how the brain functions. And it was interesting to me because it went through the steps in how our brain receives information. And since I'm a medium, I was very interested in that. But apparently, the information comes into the right hemisphere in a holographic form, and then it is transferred into 2 dimensions as it moves to the left hemisphere, and we're able to translate it and express it and talk about it. So, i.e., the information coming in from the records or from the cosmic consciousness to a medium actually enters the right hemisphere. And I was trying to relate that to what happens in an NDE, and it seems if the brainwave function in the brain, like if the hertz or the particular energy frequency that is changed, perhaps it's that the left hemisphere gets quieted to a point where we can access more of what's in the right hemisphere, and we can also allow more to come in to the right hemisphere. So apparently there's a lot of function in the right hemisphere that we never use.
Yeah.
We're not aware of it, so if we quiet the rest of the brain and allow that information to come through, I think it supports just what you're saying. And they actually relayed that information in that document that they had studies to back that up.
There are a number of references that have worked on the right side of the brain called the amygdala area, which supposedly is, quote unquote, as Melvin Morris used to call it, the God spot. There's some place on the right side of the brain in the amygdala area that is an access point. That's a place where consciousness can be contacted, information can be brought in. It's never been defined, but it's certainly been speculated on.
Yeah.
Jose has his hand raised. Jose?
I'm just going to continue this conversation, but I'm going to ask you a question. So, Tony, do you believe we are tasked with bringing whatever it is back? In your case, music, or is that more random? Is that just something that when we have this experience that we have, that it gets entangled with us and we just bring it back? Or maybe it's a memory of a past life. Maybe it's something that we've done before, because we certainly have an awareness of it that we may not believe we have. But do you think it's more like, all right, you got to go back and you bring this back with you? Or is it something that comes back with us and it's more random?
I think that it's not random. I think that there's something purposeful to it. I think that there's something to the music that I don't understand, because whenever I play concerts or I play for different things, people always come up to me and say, while I heard this music, I had this vision, or I heard this, or I felt that. I've even had people come and ask if they can lie on the floor underneath the piano to feel the vibration of that music being played. And so to me, there's something important about the music that I don't understand. I think there's something healing about it. And I'm still searching to understand what the music actually is, because I think there's more to it than just music.
Tony, do you have a recording that you could make available to us?
Sure, I published it on CD Baby.
You want to write it in the chat?
Or if you tell me, I'll write it in for you.
Yeah, it's just cdbaby.com.
CD Baby. Well, I gotta say one thing, Tony. I like how humble your approach is to that. I appreciate that. You know,
I don't see how
how you approach that, because I believe what you believe. I believe there is something there. We don't know what it is. I never try to understand what that could possibly be. But yeah, I like your humbleness when you speak to that. It makes me feel good. Just had to say that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Susan posed a question that I think you've partially answered. What was the end result of your music, and what impact did it make on those who heard it? It sounds as if a number of people have anecdotally reported to you that it touched them in ways that a piece of music wouldn't normally touch people.
Yeah.
You say there was some healing to it. Do you have any specific anecdotes of healing?
I don't. Just that I've had, I can't even tell you how many people I've had that have come up and voiced different things that they experienced with the music. And, people have brought up drawings, and said, this was occurring to me while it was being played. People have, it's been a segue for a lot of different things, but it just leaves me with the feeling that I don't really understand the full extent of it. And I wish that I could, but.
One of the reasons I was asking about getting a hold of that music, if you look over my shoulder, you see that big piece of art.
Yeah.
That came in today. That's Jose's art.
Wow.
I don't have the colored lights turned on to make it come alive, but my intention is outside in another big room. I'm going to mount that on the wall and invite people to come experience it. But I also want to include music as part of that experience. And my intent is kind of a left brain way of thinking of things. I want to bring people in and kind of get an idea how many people are touched in some some fashion that goes beyond the normal physical reality. But, I think you both came back with something, and I don't know. I may find that there aren't many people that are impacted on it, but on the other hand, if I find that a solid percentage of people have some experience, maybe that helps prompt us to do more research. What is it about things that people bring back from the other side that seem to have an impact on the quality of our life and our evolution on this side?
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Okay, well, we've been at this for quite some time now. 7 o'clock to quarter of 10 Eastern time, quarter of 9 rather. That clock hasn't been reset. So, do we have any other questions anybody would like to pose? If not, we'll start bringing this to a close. I appreciate the involvement of people. Tony, thank you for sharing your story once again. I wish you well, that you get a chance to interact with other groups, and that you have an opportunity to bring this forward.
Well, thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm.
It's always great to talk with people about this stuff.
Yeah, I think a gentleman had his hand up, Jim. I don't know if you missed it.
Okay, yes, we do. Yeah, that's right. Ron, holy cow, look at Ron's here. Ron, can you
Unmute.
you need to unmute. Ron is another, while he's trying to figure out how to unmute, Ron's
I
another.
unmuted.
There he is. Okay.
I'm trying to get into video as far as that. I'm still playing with how to, I think I turned it on. Raise hand, mute, radio. I'm trying to get the video on. Because all I got to say is yes. Yeah, you got it. Everything I heard, I'm just going, yes, yes, yes. I had my near-death experience in 1980, and when it was brand new.
Yeah.
And it changed my life. And like you had mentioned, I honestly feel that everything is happening all right now. It's just that this is the spot that we're zoned into at this moment. But I found a way, because I wanted to find a way that I could share the energy. You put it so lightly as far as love. And I wanted to find how I could share that with the world so it could understand. And I started making these ribbon roses in 1984. And I give them away. And I found this is how I do it. And there's thousands of them out there. Because if there's one thing I can do for the world is share that love.
Ron, it's good to see you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, really. Thank you. Very good. This is really getting me nice. All I'm doing is say yes.
Hey, Ron, I just highlighted your image so it can be seen more easily. Can you show the rose again?
Oh, certainly. This is one of many colors, but and this is a long stem one. I make small ones. I wear the flower every day until someone recognizes it or I see it growing in someone else and I give it away. It is the simplest way I have found to express my love for life.
Awesome.
And I've been giving them away since 1984.
Good for you.
I also like your rainbow shirt.
It's color.
All right.
Thank you again.
Thanks, everybody, for participating. We'll bring this evening to a close soon. However, I would point out, maybe, Mark, if you're still on here, do you want to comment about our upcoming Saturday?
Somebody has one of my roses.
All right.
Hi, thanks, Jim. And Tony, thank you. I enjoyed your presentation as well as everyone else here. We wanted to make everyone aware we have another Open Space Spirituality Conference coming up this Saturday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. So for people on the West Coast, we did this meeting for you so that you could get on in the morning and experience what an Open Space Spirituality Conference is. It's our second dry run that we're doing. And this one is going to be on exploring the different aspects of religion and science, or skepticism and metaphysics. So we're going to start with a theme, and we're going to build out the different breakouts that we're going to have during the conference. And we're going to talk about what people want to hear and let you actively participate in it. And then we'll have another debriefing session at the end, and also get your feedback on what you thought about the meeting. So we'd love to have you come. If you want to join us, go to the consciousness-cafe.com website, and you'll see it up at the top of the front page, and you can get the link to the Zoom meeting where we'll have it. And we'd like to have you join us. Any questions?
Is that also going to be on Meetup?
I believe it's out on Meetup, but I would say go to the Consciousness Cafe website. Yeah, it is on Meetup as a matter of fact.
Yeah, we'll publish something, a little promotional piece, at least one between now and Saturday, to refresh everybody's memory about it.
Yep. So we'd love to have you come.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, there's so many of you. I'm just looking through the names, and there are people that I would love to a number of people I'd love to have an individual 5-minute conversation with, but we can't do that this evening. I want to thank you for being here. There's so many good people in this room that we're contributing to something, and thank you for being here to hear Tony's presentation.
Thanks again.
Okay, everyone. Thank you for being here. We'll see you hopefully Saturday.
Yep.
Take
Good
care.
night.